Good day, and thank you for joining me for another 5 minute period of Bible time. Today we'll be looking at the book of First Samuel, and this is a continuation from where we stopped in the book of Ruth. And if you remember, the book of Ruth is a period within the book of Judges. So we're actually kind of continuing from where the book of Judges stopped into the book of First Samuel. And the last verse in the book of Judges kind of is a lead off or gives us the background going into the book of First Samuel. Judges 21:25 says, "And in those days, every man did that which was right in his own eyes, because there was no king in Israel at that time." Now, it's good also to note that this showed that the people were not following the law that God had given them, so they were just kind of doing their own thing. And then when we get into First Samuel, they ask for a king, and God had already warned them of this, that they will indeed ask for a king, and He had warned them of what will happen when they ask for a king, when they get a king. Deuteronomy 17:14 is where you can find that warning, and you read those verses following that. So the book of First Samuel is the period from the birth of Samuel, and it takes us to his death, and also to the death of the first king of Israel, who is Saul. And it's also important to note that in this period, and the short period following that, that the kingdom was not yet a divided nation, but was one complete nation. So if you look at the land that was possessed by the Israelites, the king ruled over all of that. It was not yet divided into two halves as it later became. Um, so some good things to note in the book of First Samuel are how Samuel came to be born. That's a pretty good thing to note, in that his mother prayed to God, asking to be able to bear a son, not just a child, but a son. And you can find this in chapter 1 of the book, when she had weaned him, that is, when the child was no longer dependent on her to get milk to be fed, she took him to the temple and left him there. So Samuel grew up in the temple, serving in the temple. So he would be pretty well experienced by the time he's old enough. And his first call, like God directly calling him, is also found in there, which is quite interesting as well. It's a good thing to note, though. Another thing is that Samuel, he anointed the first two kings of the nation of Israel. Being that there were three kings over the nation before it became a divided kingdom, he anointed the first two kings of Israel, and those being Samuel and David. So from the time that Samuel is born, he sees Eli was the priest over, was the Eli was the one over the things of the temple at the time, but his sons were wayward. But so it's a wonder as well. It says something of Samuel in that he grew up to be a man full of integrity towards God and towards his fellow Israelites. Um, Now, the book of Samuel, about chapter 25, actually records the death of Samuel. So by the time the book ends, Samuel has actually died. And the end of the book gives us the death of King Saul, which transitions into the reign of David. So a good summary maybe of the book of Samuel, First Samuel, because we have a Second Samuel, which is interesting because even though Samuel has already died, we get a Second Samuel. A good summary is, this is a period of the history of Israel where Israel gets a king. I'd say that's a pretty good one sentence summary of the book. And we see in chapter 8 where Israel demands a king, which also tells us, we see God's words in that they have rejected him. Samuel himself was pretty angry about this whole ordeal, But God came and said, you know what, let them have their king because they have rejected me. And Israel, as we continue reading their history, came to understand what God was talking about. In that you want a king, it's not really good. It's not really what you need. You know, sometimes we want things which we don't need. Um, God will often show us that, you know what, you do not need this thing. But sometimes because we persist, we get things we do not need, and we suffer for those decisions sometimes. Um, I want to think I've already mentioned this, but a lot of sufferings in the life of man is because of decisions either we have made or other people have made before us. So, this is one of the things we can learn in the book of Samuel. But yeah, I'd say that's a pretty good way to step off into that book. And if you keep that above, like as a reference point, of course, you can flesh it out or you can get your own short summary for that. But I'd say that's a pretty good way to start you off with the main points and everything. I hope this is helpful to you, and if you know anybody else who would be in need of this kind of material as well, please go ahead and share it with them. And yeah, enjoy your Bible time.